What if summer never arrived? Imagine a year where June brought blizzards, July brought killing frosts, and the sun was a dim, hazy disk in a perpetually gray sky. A year where crops failed on a global scale, igniting famine, riots, and a desperate search for survival. This isn't the plot of a disaster movie. This really happened. This is the story of 1816, the year the world called 1800 and froze to death, the year without a summer. The story begins not with a cold front, but with a fire deep within the earth, on a remote, sun-drenched island that most of the world had never even heard of. In April of 1815, on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia, a colossal mountain named Tambora, which had slumbered for centuries, began to stir. The local population noted tremors and plumes of smoke, but this was the Ring of Fire. Such events were not entirely unusual. They had no idea they were living on a geological time bomb. On the evening of April 10th, the bomb detonated. Mount Tambora erupted with a force that defies modern comprehension. It was the most powerful volcanic eruption in over 1,000 years of recorded history. The initial explosion was heard more than 1,600 miles away, so loud that military commanders on other islands thought they were under cannon attack and scrambled their troops. A column of ash, gas, and pulverized rock rocketed an astonishing 27 miles into the sky, punching deep into the stratosphere. This wasn't just an eruption, it was an evisceration. The mountain, which once stood over 13,000 feet tall, blew its top off, collapsing in on itself and losing nearly a mile of its height. For the people living on Sumbawa and the surrounding islands, the apocalypse had arrived. Rivers of fire, superheated pyroclastic flows moving at hurricane speeds, incinerated everything in their path. Entire villages, entire cultures were wiped from existence in minutes. The surrounding seas were choked with floating islands of pumice, some miles wide, making navigation impossible. Tsunamis radiated outwards, crashing into neighboring shores. The immediate death toll was staggering, estimated at over 10,000. But the true catastrophe, the global catastrophe, was just beginning. It wasn't the ash that fell back to Earth that would change the world. It was what stayed up. Tambora had injected an immense quantity of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, far above the weather and the clouds. Up there, the gas reacted with water vapor to form a vast, persistent cloud of sulfate aerosols. This wasn't a normal cloud. It was a planetary shroud. This aerosol veil began to spread, carried by the high-altitude stratospheric winds, first around the tropics and then poleward, eventually encircling the entire globe. It acted like a semi-transparent mirror in the sky. It allowed some sunlight through, but it reflected a critical percentage of solar radiation back into space. The Earth's energy budget was suddenly, drastically thrown out of balance. The planet began to cool. By 1816, a year after the eruption, the effects became terrifyingly clear. In New England, the spring was deceptively mild, but then May arrived with a vicious, unseasonable cold. Farmers who had already planted their crops watched in horror as they were killed by hard frosts. But June was when the true nightmare began. On June 6th, a blizzard swept through New England and eastern Canada, dumping nearly a foot of snow in some areas. Birds froze in mid-flight and fell from the sky. Newly shorn sheep perished in the fields. A farmer in Vermont wrote in his diary about the surreal horror of huddling by the fire, wrapped in blankets, while a snowstorm raged outside in what should have been the start of summer. The cold didn't relent. July brought more frost, with ice forming on lakes and rivers. In August, another hard freeze destroyed what little of the corn crop had managed to survive. The year was a complete agricultural wipeout. The price of grain and oats skyrocketed. People who couldn't afford to buy food were forced to eat raccoons, pigeons, and boiled nettles. Livestock that couldn't be fed were slaughtered. Families who had farmed the same land for generations packed up their meager belongings and headed west, seeking a more forgiving climate. This event became a major driver of westward expansion in America, a mass migration born from cold and desperation. The phenomenon earned chilling nicknames: the poverty year, the year of the beggar, and the most famous of all, 1800 and froze to death. Across the Atlantic, Europe was suffering its own version of the disaster. The continent was plunged into a cold, dark, and relentlessly wet summer. The sun, when visible, was often dimmed, sometimes appearing with a strange reddish or bluish tint. Sunspots were visible to the naked eye, a phenomenon that terrified a deeply religious and superstitious populace who saw it as a sign of divine wrath. In Britain, the cold and ceaseless rains caused the grain harvest to fail spectacularly. The price of wheat tripled. In Ireland, the failed potato crop, combined with the wet conditions, triggered a typhus epidemic that killed tens of thousands. The continent, already exhausted and impoverished by the Napoleonic Wars, was pushed to the brink. Food riots erupted in cities across Britain, France, and Germany. Desperate mobs broke into bakeries and granaries, crying for bread. Governments, fearing revolution, responded with brutal force. In Switzerland, the situation was perhaps the worst in all of Europe. The country experienced a full-blown famine. The relentless rain caused rivers to overflow their banks, flooding the lowlands and turning fields into muddy swamps. People were documented eating cats, dogs, and even the boiled remains of animal carcasses. The government declared a national emergency, but there was little they could do. The world felt broken, as if the natural order of the seasons had been permanently shattered. The impact stretched even further into Asia, where the effects were just as devastating but are often overlooked in Western accounts. The volcanic aerosols disrupted the delicate atmospheric patterns that govern the Asian monsoon. In China, the province of Yunnan, a key agricultural region, suffered a catastrophic famine. The unusually cold summer weather destroyed the rice crops, leading to widespread starvation and social unrest. But it was in India that Tambora's climate disruption would unleash a new, far more insidious killer. The altered monsoon patterns, with delayed and then torrential rains, created the perfect environmental conditions in the Ganges Delta for a specific bacterium to mutate. This was the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. A new, more virulent strain of cholera emerged from the stagnant, contaminated waters. At first, it was a local epidemic, but it soon began to spread. Carried by trade and military movements, it crept out of India and began a slow, inexorable march across the globe. This was the beginning of the first great cholera pandemic, a disease that would kill millions of people over the coming decades. A single volcano on a remote island had not only caused global famine, but had also midwifed a global plague. Yet, amidst all this darkness, chaos, and death, the year without a summer also gave birth to incredible, world-changing creations. The link is most famously seen in the world of literature. In Switzerland, the same relentless rain and unnatural gloom that was starving the country also trapped a group of young English writers indoors at a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva. The group included the poets Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley, Shelley's future wife Mary Godwin, and Byron's physician John Polidori. Bored and confined by the incessant rain and the wet, ungenial summer, Byron proposed a challenge. They should each try to write a ghost story. The atmosphere was perfectly primed for horror. The sky was dark, lightning storms illuminated the churning lake, and the world outside seemed to be ending. It was in this oppressive, apocalyptic gloom that 19-year-old Mary Godwin had a waking dream, a terrifying vision of a scientist who creates life, only to be horrified by his creation. She began to write. Her story would become one of the most famous and influential novels ever written, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. On those same dark nights, John Polidori penned a story called The Vampire, creating the suave, aristocratic vampire archetype that would directly inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula decades later. The very monsters that haunt our modern nightmares were born from the atmospheric fallout of Tambora. The strange skies also inspired a different kind of artist. The volcanic aerosols scattered sunlight in a peculiar way, especially at dawn and dusk. The light had to travel through more of the aerosol layer when the sun was low on the horizon, which scattered the blue light and allowed the reds, oranges, and yellows to dominate. The result was sunsets of an unearthly, spectacular, and often terrifying beauty. The English painter J.M.W. Turner captured these incredible skies in his work. His paintings from this period are famous for their dramatic, fiery sunsets and hazy, yellow-tinged light. For a long time, art critics thought his style was simply an artistic choice, a move towards Impressionism. But scientists have since analyzed the volcanic ash layers and ice cores and correlated them with Turner's paintings. They found that his most dramatic red skies correspond perfectly with the period of Tambora's atmospheric dust. He wasn't just imagining it, he was painting a global catastrophe. The disaster also spurred a remarkable technological innovation. In Germany, the agricultural failure was so severe that oats, the primary food for horses, became prohibitively expensive. Horses, the main mode of transportation for millennia, were starving and being slaughtered in massive numbers. This created a serious transportation crisis. A German civil servant and inventor named Karl von Dries was grappling with this problem. He sought to create a personal mode of transport that didn't require a living engine. In 1817, in the direct aftermath of the horse crisis, he unveiled his invention, the Laufmaschine, or running machine. It was a simple two-wheeled contraption with a steering mechanism but no pedals. The rider would push it along with their feet. It was clumsy and looked a bit ridiculous, but it was the direct ancestor of the modern bicycle. The greatest transportation crisis since the domestication of the horse had given birth to a revolutionary new machine. For years, the world struggled to understand what had happened. Without modern meteorology or global communication, people were left to speculate. Many believed it was a divine punishment. Others blamed it on Benjamin Franklin's lightning rods, believing they had somehow disturbed the atmosphere. Some even pointed to the increase in sunspots. The connection to a volcano half a world away was not made for decades. It was only later, through the painstaking work of scientists studying ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, that the full picture emerged. These ice cores act as a frozen calendar of atmospheric history. By drilling deep into the ice, scientists can analyze the layers deposited each year. The ice layer for 1816 contained a massive spike in sulfate deposits, a chemical fingerprint that could only have come from a massive volcanic eruption. By cross-referencing this data with historical records, they definitively linked the global climate chaos of 1816 to the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815. The year without a summer was a brutal lesson in planetary interconnectedness. It demonstrated, with terrifying clarity, how a single event in one remote corner of the globe could have profound and far-reaching consequences for all of humanity. It showed how fragile our agricultural systems are, how quickly civilization can be destabilized when the food runs out. It highlighted the complex, and often invisible, chains of cause and effect that govern our world, a volcano causing a famine which causes a migration, which inspires a novel, which spurs an invention, which unleashes a pandemic. The world eventually recovered. As the sulfate aerosols slowly fell out of the stratosphere over the next few years, global temperatures returned to normal. The seasons fell back into their familiar rhythm. Summer came back, but the world had been changed forever. The scars of 1816 remained. It fueled the first wave of the opioid crisis, as farmers in Europe and America turned to growing opium poppies, one of the few cash crops that thrived in the poor conditions. It rewrote demographic maps as people fled the devastated regions. It left a legacy of folklore, of a dark and hungry time when the sun hid its face and summer was stolen from the world. Today, we face our own set of global challenges. We worry about climate change, about the potential for nuclear winter, about the ever-present threat of another supereruption. The story of Tambora and the year without a summer is not just a historical curiosity. It is a profound cautionary tale. It serves as a stark reminder of the immense power of nature and the delicate balance of the planetary systems that sustain us. It shows us that we live on a dynamic and sometimes violent planet where the past is never truly past, and the echoes of a single cataclysmic day can reverberate across centuries, shaping our art, our technology, our diseases, and the very stories we tell ourselves in the dark. The year 1816 was a global tragedy, but it was also a moment of stark revelation, pulling back the curtain to show the intricate, and often terrifying, web that connects us all. The fire of the earth and the chill of the sky combined to create a year that would never be forgotten, a year that stands as a permanent monument to the fragility of human civilization in the face of a planet that is very much alive.